Vince Cable, thank you very much for joining us. If you weren't a politician, what do you think you might be doing?
Well, I love books, reading and writing, and I've written quite a few books in my time, and I had one bestseller actually before I got into the cabinet. So I have a list of books that I'd quite like to write, so I think I'd do that. And I love dancing. I've got through my medal test, so I might even do some teaching. So I think those two things, and I'd spend more time with my grandchildren and my lovely wife and on her farm when I get time. So there's a lot of things I'd like to do, but I'm, in this job you don't get much time off.
Do you think you may pursue those interests at a later stage?
Yes, eventually. But I'm fully tied up with my constituency work and my ministerial job.
Absolutely. And you started political life, I think, with the Liberals, but you were then a member of Labour for 16 years and then joined the Social Democrats, I think.
That was part of the Lib Dems.
The Lib Dems, that's exactly right.
That was 30 years ago.
30 years ago, yes. Yeah. So how comfortable were you with joining the Conservative Party in coalition?
Not very comfortable, but I think it was something, we had to do for two reasons, really. I mean, one is the country needed a government, and it was the only form of stable government that could be created. We could have had the Tories or even the Labour Party in a minority government. There'd have been another election a few months later. So it provided the country with stable government, and I think more important, we were in the middle of a very serious economic crisis. We had this enormous deficit in the budget. There was a lot of panic around. The world hadn't fully caught up with the banking crisis and its aftermath. And I think we felt, or certainly I felt anyway, a sense of duty, obligation that we had to contribute. So I wasn't very comfortable about it because I've been fighting the Tories all my political life, but nonetheless in a grown-up world you sit down and you work with people, you don't necessarily agree with them, but if there's a common interest and a national interest, you operate in a business-like way, and we've done that, and I've actually got perfectly good business-like relations with the Conservatives, though I'm no closer to being a Conservative now than I was when I started.
We're here in Twickenham, a town that was, I think it hosted actually a visit from Portugal's last king, Manuel II. So if you could host and bring here any current world leader, who would that be?
Well, the current crop of world leaders aren't vintage, probably. The great figures of the past have all moved on. I think having the President of the United States here would be actually a great honour, not just because of his importance, but because of who he is.
Do you prioritise your role as a constituency MP over that of business secretary?
Well, I think they're both crucially important, one for the country, one for the constituents. I don't think you can say one is more or less important than the other, but I certainly believe, I mustn't lose my constituency role. I think, quite a lot of ministers do, unfortunately, and they lose touch. But I took the view from the very beginning that even though I was in the cabinet, I had one or two bad experiences with people abusing the surgery system. I was going to set aside, every Friday evening I'll be here, come what may. I sometimes have to change it to a Saturday or a Monday morning, but I do one a week. And I travel in on the train every morning from Twickenham station, meet constituents on the platform and then the crowded train. So I do manage to keep in touch, though my ministerial job is very demanding. It's extremely long hours and emotionally taxing. Obviously, if I was being the local MP on a full-time basis, I would have more time to spend, as I did before, but it helps in other ways because there are things I can help with in a concrete way that I probably wasn't able to do.
And you can draw comparisons from your work on...
Yes, a very good example is I very often work with local companies who turn to me because I'm the business secretary. I know things, I know how things work and how banks work, and come to me for advice. I have to be careful because under the ministerial code you can't give them preference, but I am able to help indirectly and in a proper way.
In times of real need, I think politicians from both sides, as we've seen from all areas of this political circle, both sides of the political spectrum, come together and they join forces in an attempt to help the country out and do what's necessary. So do you think that perhaps holds up a light to the artifice of political allegiances and parties?
I think it does. I think British politics is very tribal.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of aggro, which is, not based on anything other than kind of some tribal loyalty.
Yeah.
And it's a very unproductive way of behaving. You see people in Parliament shouting at abuse at each other. Often they don't mean it. I mean, to some extent it's play acting, but also to some extent they do, and people are just not thinking past their party allegiance. I think the country does expect, certainly at times of war, that parties will vary their differences, but in times of extreme economic difficulty, I think you can expect that too. And it's considered very unusual in the UK. It's the first time we've had this side of the war. There was a lot of abuse initially from people who think you're acting as a traitor or something if you work with other people in the national interest. A very odd way of thinking, in my view. In Germany, this is considered perfectly normal. The Germans have had one coalition. They've now got a coalition between the Conservatives and the Socialists, which is very difficult to conceive of in Britain. But they just treat that as a sensible way to run the country.
You're a keen ballroom dancer, I think.
Yes, I've just come from my weekly class.
Have you indeed?
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
That's why I keep keeping you waiting.
Do you have any other hidden talents?
Well, I think that's the one I work hardest on.
Yes.
I mean, when I was younger, I was actually very good at sport and did lots of things. And later in life, I learned to ride. When I was actually over 60, I learned to ski, and I'm actually quite competent.
Yes.
Not many people know I'm a pilot. I haven't kept my license going. I learnt many years ago, but there are lots of things. If I had time and money, I would spend more time doing.
Oh, fantastic. On a scale of 1 to 10, how well would you say has your constituency here in Twickenham? How well has it fared under the current coalition government?
I think it's at the upper end of. I mean, everybody's been hit. I mean, there's been a big crisis. The country's poorer. I mean, that's the nature of this crisis we've been through. But I think we are relatively, I would say 7 or something like that. Right. I mean, there are some communities that have been very badly hit by unemployment and so on. And
that's under the current coalition government. It is speculation, but if perhaps the Liberal Democrats had achieved an outright majority in 2010, what would you have done things differently, do you think?
Yes, we've made it very clear we had different priorities and we've had to compromise on things. I think, a lot of the difficult decisions we'd have had to make anyway. Any government would have had to face the need to deal with the budget deficit and make difficult cuts and so on. That was, in any event. I mean, I think we're different in a variety of ways. I think, my party does tend to emphasise environmental values rather more. I think we would have probably tried to do more to shield some of the key services. Some of the welfare cuts have been very painful, and I think we would have tried to avoid some of that. I think some of the most unpopular reforms have turned out to be quite successful, as in higher education, but it wasn't easy at the time.
George Galloway said recently that he's considering running for Mayor of London. And here in London, would you have a preference on the who you'd like to see?
I've never been terribly interested in London government, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it was suggested once I should run, but I've never.
Did you consider it?
I've never felt very much a Londoner, actually. I feel very attached to Twickenham.
Yeah.
And I feel very attached to Britain.
Yeah.
But I'm a Yorkshireman who lived in Scotland and has lived abroad, and I don't feel London very much, so I don't terribly engage with London government. I mean, it's the fact of life; you have to deal with it. I thought Livingston was okay when he started, but then he went downhill a bit and took a bit too much for granted. I mean, Johnson is a very good public performer. People like him, but I'm not sure he's achieved very much in office, concretely. The Olympics went well, but the foundations had already been laid. So I think that's fairly mixed judgments. Actually.
Right. Okay. Have you given up the fight to scrap first past the post?
No, I think future governments are going to come back to it. I mean, ironically, the big losers could potentially be the Conservatives, because they've fought to keep the present system. Yes. They may find that they don't get the majority they're looking for because the present system works against them, and having thought that it was to their advantage. No, I think the current system is designed for a two parties essentially, and which was the case after the Second World War. But we now have three significant, maybe UKIP and others will come up. We're a bit more like Germany, but there's a bit more choice. People want more variety, and you can't fit that into a first past the post system.
Don't you think the public do recognise that, but then they have overwhelmingly voted in favour to keep the system?
Yes, they did, and of course you respect the verdict. Yeah. I think there were a mixture of reasons why that happened. We were the only party who were really campaigning for it. The Labour Party had said they were in favour, but then they sort of melted away, and when the battle had to be joined, and didn't do much to help. It may have been that the particular formula that we put forward, the alternative vote, people didn't get hooked on. So I think the idea of reforming the system has not gone away, and I think it, within 5 years, I suspect we'll come back to it. But there's no point crying over spilt milk. It's not there now.
Have you taken a decision over the years as a politician that perhaps stands out as the toughest or most challenging?
Well, I think it was the series of cuts we had to make
that
around
recently.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think if you're talking more personally and longer term. Probably in a way the most difficult thing on a purely personal level was standing in at 97 and then again in 2001 when my wife, Olympia, was very ill with cancer, and there was a part of me that just wanted to walk away from the whole thing and just, spend time with her. But she was insistent that I'd put so much effort into it and she'd given so much help that she didn't want me to give up.
I think your son as well, didn't he? Played a big part in that.
Yes, that's right. It was, on a purely personal level, probably that was the most difficult period I had to make decisions. But politically, certainly at the beginning of this government, inheriting this terrible mess, having to cut things that people valued, it was actually really difficult. It's got a lot of aggression. I think people have now settled and recognise that we did what we had to do and probably made some good choices overall, but it was very difficult at the time.
So with a lifetime spent in politics and 16 years as a Member of Parliament, what has been your greatest political achievement, do you think?
Well, I didn't spend a lifetime in politics, actually. I've stood for Parliament. I got elected at age 54, and I had a big career before.
Would you not say that you were fairly political before that?
I was fairly political, but most of my adult life I've been doing other things.
Okay.
And I think, and it may sound a little corny, but I think my biggest achievement actually is having brought up and a successful, happy family actually, and maintained 2 happy marriages. Yes. I think given the strains that people face in public life, particularly in politics, I think that I would register that as a fairly significant achievement. Yes. I think in my present job, I've done an awful lot that will stand the test of time, actually.
And when you've left office, that won't be any time soon.
No, I'm not looking for a way out. But it's other people's. I depend on other people for that.
Absolutely. And just walking down, coming here along the roads and the main high street, there are plenty of businesses that help boost, of course, the local economy and bring jobs and things. But they have been in the news recently, haven't they, large businesses, because it's claimed that they pay far too little corporation tax.
Yes.
So, assuming it is all according to the letter of the law, is the fault of the companies themselves, or is it the tax system that's just not fit for purpose?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two. The tax system is very complicated. Yeah. It's based on national tax objectives, which are often obsolete in a highly kind of international world. Some companies have a sense of social obligation and feel they owe something to the country in which they operate. Others think that they should push the very limits of what the law allows. I mean, they're not acting illegally, but they're certainly pushing the limits. I think there's no point as politicians whinging about it. We've just got to try and change the system so we do get proper tax revenue from companies that operate and make their money here. And one of the practical things I'm doing to try and get around this problem is to introduce a system of what we call beneficial ownership, so that there is a proper register of who owns companies, which we don't know in many cases. Yeah. It's ownership is buried somewhere overseas, and so that will all be brought out much more into the open, and that will help deal with tax issues and money laundering and other things that go on.
And of course the government has control over that tax system, doesn't it? So is it something that you are looking to change?
Oh yes, I mean in theory the government has control over it, but of course when companies find it easy to move from one place to another, then they can choose where they locate. And we have tax havens. Now some of them are nominally under British jurisdiction, but we can't really send gunboats into Guernsey and the Isle of Man or the Virgin Islands. I mean, in theory we could, but it's in practice it's more difficult. I mean, you do need to deal with these things in a collaborative way with other countries, and in particular within the European Union.
Vince Cable, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
Cheers.
You. Cheers.